Well, our next presenter, Heather, brings a very unique background, at least I believe, and a perspective from her career path. She's got a PhD in psychology and is serving as the Chief Data Officer at IDA. And she's incorporating the importance of mental models in adoption. So it's wonderful to have her present her observations and learnings and how the data-centric vision kind of fits into the future of information management and knowledge sharing at IDA. So I guess we're ready when you are, Heather.
Okay, awesome. So, yes, thank you. I am very excited to have been invited to talk with you all and kind of get to know the data-centric community. IDA is very new to that community. We started our journey in the middle of 2021. So I've been impressed to see how everyone else is progressing. And we are just getting started. So I've been taking lots of notes today. But yeah, as Steve mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of mental model for data-centric adoption, including adoption of the general view of data centricity, the general approach, as well as the associated technologies, in particular knowledge graphs. But before we do that, I want to tell you a little bit about myself to give you some context for how I've approached this. And then we'll jump into maybe some context about IDA to give you a sense of the kind of company we are, what size we are, what it is that we do exactly. And then I will try to embed any of my recommendations into specific, things that we've done as our journey has started. So I've been in some sort of research or data-related role for about 15 years now, and that spans both academia, government, and industry. So I came into my current role with a lot of experience. Sorry, someone is chatting me here on the side. A lot of experience on the analysis side of the house. Oh, sorry. I can hide that. Maybe. On the analysis side of the house, so conducting analyses in the areas of public health. For example, I worked for a long time with large government data sets, looking at, how different socioeconomic factors affect health decisions. And then I sort of moved on from that and started working at the North Carolina Department of Commerce, where I looked at workforce development needs, again, looking at large data sets from across the state in order to look at our workforce development needs, particularly as they relate to broadband. And then sometime later, I found myself in national security, which is where I stayed for some time. And in particular, I spent about 5 years working on test and evaluation of defense military systems. And I became an assistant director, leading a team that looked at statistical methods, how we advance statistical methods for testing and evaluating those types of systems before I moved into my current role, where I oversee the research quality at the Institute, and I am the chief data officer here, overseeing our data strategy implementation. So one thing I've noticed along the way is that sort of no matter where I've been, people tend to emphasize the technology aspects for analysis, for data management, sometimes at the expense of the human aspects. And I found, particularly in my current role, where I do a lot of work with our leadership team, trying to get buy-in for things like the data-centric approach, for procuring a knowledge graph, for example, that it's really those human factors that make a great deal of the difference in getting buy-in and adoption of these technologies, at least among our senior leadership. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is mental models. So these are basically cognitive models that exist in your head about everything around you. So you take in information about the world, and something happens in your black box in your mind that tells you, how that thing in your environment works and what you're supposed to do with it. And then we spit out behavior on the other end. And knowledge graphs and the data-centric approach aren't really any different than that. We have to find a way to communicate to people the essential pieces of information that they need about what it means to be data-centric. They've got to understand the general concept and how that's supposed to affect their behavior in order for us to get the behavior that we want. So before I jump into that, I just want to tell you a little bit about IDA. So we are about 1,500 people. We are a company that operates 3 federally funded research and development centers for federal government. And our primary sponsors are the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House and the Department of Defense. So we operate, as I mentioned, those 3 FFRDCs with a mission basically to answer our federal government sponsors' research questions. So questions that they have about national security and science policy. The main thing that we produce are research projects. So I was happy to hear the last talk. I'll take a few nuggets of wisdom from there about how we upskill our researchers to know a little bit more about the knowledge graph and the capabilities that it can bring. That rang very true to me, but that's the primary thing that we output are these research products and projects, and we do that on a wide range of topics for a broad range of government sponsors. So we look at anything from assessing the capabilities of emerging and critical technologies and weapon systems to assessing how we can increase the number of low-income students who are applying for federal grants in STEM fields, and assessing strategy and forces for our military. So this is just a sampling of the different agencies that we work for across the federal government, and there are certainly many more, but by a large margin, our biggest sponsor is the Department of Defense. So we also have a very unique workforce, and we're very fortunate to have it. 90% of our researchers hold STEM degrees, and you can see a distribution there. And 90% of those researchers also hold graduate degrees, so master's or PhDs. So these are folks who require a substantial amount of evidence that an idea is useful, or they're very challenging to move. And that's great in many respects. That keeps us from doing silly things, but it also means that they're very skeptical. And so we have to do a very good job of giving them the mental models that they need for why we want to adopt a data-centric approach in the first place. So You've maybe noticed, if you are following trends in the federal government, if you put the politics piece aside, there is perhaps one of the biggest federal reforms happening in the US ever right now related to data management. And so we've recently seen the government put out the federal data strategy, which, hopes to help the public by bringing together public data from across the federal government into a single place so that our citizens can leverage it, or companies can leverage it, whoever needs it. And we've also enacted laws that mandate that there's a CDO in each federal agency across the government. And within those agencies, many of them have CDOs within sub-organizations. That's certainly true of the DoD. All of this is changing the way that IDA is producing research and interacting with our sponsors, right? So there's now a demand signal from Congress saying you have to care about data management, and our sponsors are going to look to us in order to help them fulfill that mandate that they have. And certainly the Department of Defense, being our largest sponsor, they have actually explicitly used the term data-centric. So they have a goal to make the department data-centric. We're working on figuring out, whether there's a shared vision of what that means across the department currently, but we want to be able to position ourselves in a place where we can help them do that. So that's one motivation for IDA, and thinking about data management and sort of evolving towards a data-centric model. But we also have some internal demand signals that have been kind of kicking up since about 2019. So, data has been an intricate part of who we are for a very long time, basically since World War II. We've been using data to do analysis and provide the government insight. But most of that focus was on later parts of the data lifecycle and analysis and visualization capabilities until about 2019, where we started to see a shift both within our leadership and among our research staff kind of at the same time, where there was this recognition that, we've made a lot of progress and innovation in analysis methods, and we've implemented those, but the next big innovation is going to come from how we manage our data. And so lots of things have followed from that. The research staff stood up sort of a makeshift data governance committee, and they started working amongst themselves to figure out what is this data governance thing in the first place, but they didn't really have any authority to do anything. And they started assessing data management. So they went out and they found some publicly available maturity models, and they started, assessing data management across the company, or as best they could. We found out that those didn't fit us very well because we have sort of a strange business model. But, there was that desire there. In late 2019, our president at the time declared data as a top enterprise risk for the company, right? So we have our own data that we produce, but we also take in lots of data from the federal government, which is sensitive and can't be shared publicly. If any of that were to be mismanaged, that would be a huge reputational risk for the company. So they declared data as an enterprise risk. This makeshift data governance committee is sort of working along, and they've both come to this conclusion that they need a belly button in order to be able to, look across the enterprise and manage our data and our risk. And so they hired a CDO. And I'm very happy that that was me. So they hired me, in 2021, and then everything sort of started moving quickly from there. You'll see here in the coming slides that I had some help finding my way to the data-centric vision, that I didn't start there when I was hired. There were some evangelists among us. And the data-centric approach has sort of, they've made me a convert. We've worked on making lots of other people a convert, and it's become a sort of a central tenet of our data strategy and our annual action plans. And we're, still early in our journey, but excited to be moving forward. One of the first things that I did when I got hired is walk around and just talk to everyone. And, these are just some examples of some of the things that people said to me as we were talking about what's working well for them, what's not working well for them as they interact with data. They can't find prior research, right? So to the previous talk that we just heard, it's difficult to find existing knowledge in my area that's relevant to me. That's both, knowledge that exists outside of IDA, but most importantly, from my perspective, the knowledge that exists internal, the things that we've already produced previously. That sharing data is difficult. That's good in some cases. In some cases, we don't want them sharing data because of classification levels and data access controls imposed on us by the government. But in other cases, it's for completely artificial reasons. And so overcoming that has been a key goal of mine. They have to enter data over and over again, right? These are all symptoms of data that lives in lots of places and isn't very well connected to one another. I have to go to 20 places to find the information I need. And then from our IT team, saying it's really hard for us to be able to integrate this, data because the information models inside each of these systems are just, it's difficult to reconcile them. So in some cases, our systems are not integrated well. And as I talk to people, and as people talk to me about data and data centricity in particular, one thing I notice is that this concept, particularly for people who aren't sort of immersed in it all the time, where this isn't their expertise, right? Like those research teams that we heard about in the previous talk, or my leadership team, where they're experts in national security or science policy or finance or whatever. This concept is abstract, and they can interpret it in lots of ways. They might all be very on board with the term data-centric, but to one of them, it's just a synonym for data-driven. For another one, it has something about using data, generally speaking, to help with decisions. There's not sort of a well-recognized and established concept of what data-centric means for them. And even if you show them some central tenets of what it means to be data-centric, right? So that the architecture centers around a single extensible model. That's very difficult for them to digest, right? Or that data is the primary architectural component. Well, unless they're an IT professional, that's not going to resonate with them. So we have to find a way to give them a mental model that's going to work for them. One that is a cognitive representation that tells them, ideally very efficiently, how a technology will work. So how does semantic technology work? How does an ontology work? How does a knowledge graph work? And how are they supposed to use it? How should they behave toward it? And it's difficult to do that with the language that we have currently. So as I mentioned before, I sort of I came into my role from the analysis end. Data management was kind of an assumed thing, and I got some data. I put it into the format I needed it in, and then I analyzed it. And luckily, not too late after I started, a couple of folks approached me. They're here on this slide. They don't know they're on the slide, so we'll see. Maybe they'll see a recording of this and be surprised later. But both of these women were very senior within our national security organizations, and they worked in information technology. And they said, what we were trying to do was this thing that people are calling data-centric now. This is where we were trying to go. And we're still trying to get there. After decades, we're still trying to move in that direction. And none of our problems are going to be solved until we get that vision into people's heads. And they did their very best to indoctrinate me, giving me all sorts of things to read, talking with me at length in order to make data-centric something that was more concrete for me. And at some point, the light bulb sort of went on, and they served as great allies for me as I went out into my organization, talking to my leadership team, to be able to point back to them and say, hey, it's not just my crazy idea. You can go talk to these people as well. And that's something that I think is very powerful as, an organization starts to evolve to become more data-centric, that you have, more than one advocate for this idea, right? Because they may not trust me, the new person coming in on day one, but they might trust someone who's been around the block for 10, 20 years, for example. That may not be possible in all organizations, by the way. We have kind of an amazing retention rate here of about a decade. So our people stick around for a long time. Let me just give you a couple of examples of what I mean by a mental model that is compelling. You might remember the desktop computer. There aren't so many of those around nowadays. Most of them are laptops. But some of you might know what a desktop computer is. And if you think that the desktop computer was named because it sits on a desk, it wasn't. And that is just a sign that you've grown up with computers your whole life. The desktop computer is a metaphor for a no-kidding, legitimate desktop. One that you have papers on and you write notes on, and there's a little trash bin over here on the side, and you have filing folders, right? If you look at those early interfaces for desktop computers, for personal computers, they mimic a desktop, and they do it on purpose, right? Because bundled into that metaphor are all sorts of implications about the way that you should behave, right? So there are windows, which you can stack on top of each other in a very similar way to stacking paper on top of each other, for example. There are file folders, which you might use to organize your things. There is a trash bin, which is very self-explanatory, right? You don't want your thing that you made anymore, just like you do in the physical world, you toss it in the trash. You can do that now in the digital world, and you toss it into the virtual trash can. This is very compelling, right? I can look at that interface. I have this reference, this model of the desktop. I know how a desktop works. And now I can start to make that bridge from the physical world to the digital world with relative ease. Here's another example that is really excellent. The Kindle, for example. I don't know how many of you have a Kindle. I think I have like 4 Kindles. But it's very obvious, right? A book. A book is the metaphor here. A Kindle isn't actually a book. It contains, digital representations of a book, but it operates in almost exactly like a book, right? So much so that you hold it, you take your finger, you swipe the page, and that's how you turn the page, just like when you turn the page in an actual book, right? No one had to teach anybody that behavior. They just did it. And they did it because built into that metaphor are the implications for behavior. We also know that, and I just put some successful examples here because we don't want to emulate the bad ones, but we know that when we get these metaphors wrong, that they either hinder adoption, that technology isn't adopted, or it's adopted in ways that lead to unintended consequences. So, for example, we can see the way that poor mental models play into lots of disasters, like 3 Mile Island, right? The mental models of the actual control room, just there was no way to form one. Or the USS McCain is a disaster near and dear to my heart, which was a disaster, a Navy shipwreck in 2017, which killed a few soldiers. And that was an issue with the mental models of the workstation used to control the ships. So we can see the repercussions of what these metaphors are for predicting how people will actually interact with technology. There are a lot of metaphors for data. You may have noticed this. Data is oil, it's currency, it's water, it's nuclear power, which I thought was an interesting one, right? There's 1,000 metaphors for data. And there's 1,000 metaphors for how we store data. We store them in data warehouses and data lakes and data lake houses. And if we're not careful, we're going to have a sea of metaphors, none of which really tell us how we're supposed to be interacting with that technology or tell us what we really need to know about the concepts, right? I don't know what the implication is for me, for example, of how I'm supposed to interact with a data lakehouse, right? Well, I know what a lakehouse is, but the point being, there's not a clear correlation in the same way that there is for the desktop, in the same way that there is for the book, right? We have a lot of metaphors floating around that serve in many ways to confuse people who aren't experts in our area. So we need to be careful in what metaphors we choose. I have been trying for some months now to devise the perfect metaphor for what it means to be data-centric. I've bounced many different versions off of my deputy here, and we've not settled on one that makes us satisfied. And preferably, we would have one for all the reasons that we saw with the desktop and the Kindle. But it is possible to build effective mental models without them, but it is challenging. And so my hope is to walk through a little bit of what we've been trying to do in coordination with a broader team, including some of our semantic arts team that's here. I've seen them on the chat. So one piece of advice, if you don't have the perfect metaphor, is to make it as visual as you can and make it as concrete as you possibly can. So this is after I failed many times at getting people to understand what I was saying about what an ontology is and what data-centric means. I landed on this figure, which has a depiction of just a portion of our ontology, It's just a little diagram. So our research projects are at the center, and those have sub-projects. They all have sponsors, and they all belong to different divisions who have research programs, and all of those belong to IDA, etc. You know how to read these diagrams. Many of them don't, but being able to walk them through this, for them to see, oh, we've put together something that reflects the way that I actually think about my work, right? That actually, this is how I actually approach my job day to day. Yeah, kind of a map. That this is how I approach my work. And all of these different colors represent the different systems where information resides about each of these things that actually matter to our business, right? So we have data about research products in this system 1, and also about our quality control processes in system 1, but there's also some quality control process in system 2, for example. This other system holds a bunch of data about our research program and projects, which is separate from the data in system 4 that has our budget information, etc. But to show them, right, a map like this, to acknowledge the differences where the data is coming from, the implication here is these should all fit together. They should all be connected, right? And we've built a map that will connect them in a way that will be meaningful to you. It's a very powerful way to communicate, I found. It was sort of a lights on moment, at least for our leadership team. Connecting it to their needs. So we spent a lot of time interviewing folks, sitting down with them, talking to them about what's working, what's not working. And most of the complaints boiled down to integration problems. And, I didn't have a good way to talk to them about that in a very compelling way. So I started drawing pictures. Right. So I showed them this little picture here on the left, something actually a little more complex that represented our actual architecture, and said, this is what we have now. Here are our systems. Remember from the previous slide, here are all those different systems. They're all directly connected to each other, but each one of them has their own way to represent the data inside of that little box. And so these connections aren't perfect, right? Sometimes we have people hand jamming information that we entered into this system as well. And that happens in lots of places across the architecture. It's also the case that once we build out all these connections, we get afraid to choose a different system, right? Because then we have to rebuild all those connections. And so now we're afraid to choose a new information system or get rid of an information system, because now we have to reimagine what all those connections are and redo all that work. And so meeting them where their pain points are and finding a way to visually depict those for them is something that I think can be very powerful for you as you're, trying to articulate the value of what the knowledge graph can bring. And so we went from, here's what we look like today, here's where we want to go, right? We're going to take this little map that we've built over here, we're going to put that at the middle, and we're going to take all the data from these different systems and we're going to fit it underneath that map, right? And then that map can send data to other systems, so we don't have to enter information more than once, right? So connecting it to their need, making it very visual for them, that's the easy part. The harder part is involving them in the process. So I think this has actually been the most fruitful thing, right? You need the diagrams, you need the pictures in order to convince them to even show up in the first place when you invite them to these little workshops. But we hold a workshop about once a month. And we take members of our staff and our leadership team. We bring them into the room for varying amounts of time, somewhere 90 minutes, sometimes longer. And we have a conversation with them about how it's going. What do they do in their daily work? And we write a bunch of things down. And in about a month, we bring them one of these maps. And we ask them to sit and think through those maps with us. What's missing? What doesn't look right here? And we build out more detail under those maps. They get personally invested in that process, right? They say, yeah, that's me. That's what I do. Wait, you forgot a thing that I do over here. This piece of information is important too. And then they become advocates for you, right? They start to form an intuition of what the model is, what it's doing for you, and they get personally invested in the process itself. The other thing we do is each month, we demonstrate we have a proof of concept knowledge graph that we have up and running. We demonstrate to them what they've made. So they helped us make this model, then we take their data, we structure it underneath this model, and we show them, we try to answer the challenges that they've put in front of us. Sometimes we can, and sometimes we can, to a lesser degree. But we try to show them progress each month. So we've been doing this for about 10 or 11 months, maybe. And I think we've demoed like 8 times, maybe 9 times. So they're getting a lot of frequent feedback and getting to see the development. And at first, that was a hard sell. But after they saw it a couple times, they want to come back each month. They literally ask to come back and see the progress that has been made. So I think that is probably the most effective means of helping people develop that mental model for what we're trying to do in the data-centric approach, and what that ontology is in the first place, and what the heck is a knowledge graph. We have now our leadership team walking around using the term data-centric in ways that I would view to be appropriate. And they're referencing it in terms of the capability that it would bring as they make decisions about whether they're going to bring an information system into our architecture or not. And I think that's, leaps and bounds from where we were before. It's now become an integral part of our data strategy. It's sort of a central tenet. Within a year, we're at a place where we've made we've built out a large portion of our model. We've demonstrated value in our proof of concept, and we have buy-in to begin actually transitioning now our production systems into this data-centric architecture. So we're procuring a knowledge graph. We're doing that now. We're thinking hard about the order in which we'll transition data, basically transition the feeds that we have currently integrating system to system to integrate through the knowledge graph itself. We're working on designing a security concept within the graph, which is something that's particularly important to us because of the kinds of information that we deal with in national security. There is some hesitance about adopting a new technology for which we don't have a good mental model of what security looks like. We're also trying to give people a mental model for the new way that we can begin building applications off of the knowledge graph. So we have been working on plans to develop a model-driven application to show them how easy that is and give them something to choose besides, for example, a very large and expensive new information system. And we're continuing to extend the data model, keeping that sort of healthy drumbeat going where we're engaging our staff. We want to keep building trust in both the model and the technology, so those demonstrations are important. And we're also looking now, turning our attention to building capacity to leverage the technology. So how do we begin to teach our IT team who knows SQL? How do we teach them Sparkle? How do we teach them to create data models in this new way? We need to have a plan and a training paradigm for that and be able to talk to them about that. And then we need to be able to, in the future, transition that to our research staff as well. So, you know, that's where our headspace is moving forward. And I see a lot of links in the in the chat, but you know, this is sort of my get off the slide or get off the stage slide here. But I think, you know, one thing that has become really apparent is that we're not going to get buy-in if we haven't given people a compelling mental model, right? If I don't have my president coming and saying, hey, I heard some awesome stuff about this knowledge graph. Let me see it. I want to engage with that. Or can the knowledge graph do this? Because I know it can do that. Those are indications that people are beginning to form a healthy mental model of the technology and of the approach. And I think that has, you know, been incredibly powerful for us to get buy-in and move quickly in our transformation so far. And I think it's a little bit different from some of the nature of the talks that we've heard so far today, but I would welcome any questions or thoughts that people have from the audience.
While we're waiting on those to come through, Heather, your last slide said something about answering previously unanswerable questions. How have you gone about kind of finding what the most valuable of those questions might be, or where you might start, I guess, there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think we've tried lots of different versions of this. At one point, I did a bunch of interviews at the very beginning of time across the company where I jotted down lots of pain points and specific questions that people had, which was very helpful to sort of get me kickstarted on, you know, where are the common pain points across the company. But we revisit this basically each month when we sit down with our staff and we ask them to tell us a little bit about their job and how they think about it, how they approach it. Inevitably, we get challenges through that conversation. Some of them are, you know, things that we've heard before. Some of them are novel. You know, another approach that we took was to get a bunch of people who have strong feelings about what we could do better in a room. And we literally just generated lots of, you know, feedback about questions they wish they could answer now that they can't. Things that would be helpful for them in their research projects or managing research. And we just created a giant Excel spreadsheet, and we've literally been just going through them to make sure that we can, you know, address those.
Hey, yeah, thank you, Heather. Very interesting, and it really, I really like that perspective. I only had confused thinking about this, but it's a thing to really worry about. So one of the things that I've seen having sort of success as a sort of mental model, then turning almost into a brand, has been, at least in certain organization, the ability for data to serve the functional purpose of a ton of data applications. Like I wonder if you have sort of seen that, or if you have discussed that internally. Like, in my case, I mean, in my experience, the situation is that I've seen like a truckload of integration project and data architectures conducted for integration that, as well as they're designed, they always lead to a somewhat frustrating conclusion in which you still people who need to use the data and who have important questions about the data and discovery and analysis, et cetera, they need applications to access them. And I think that data-centric thing, that sort of the data-centric team that seemed to have been sort of effective at a certain level of leadership in some organization, is that you don't want to keep building applications. You want to engineer in things in a way that they serve functional purposes and functional sort of inquest or request, like directly, or can you reuse it? I wonder if that's like something that I like more the visual sort of metaphors that you use, but I don't know exactly if the two things can be reconciled, or if you've seen this theme emerge in your experience.
Yeah, so I think there are probably different degrees to which every organization can jump into the idea that we leave all of our information systems behind. I think for us, we're continuing to believe that our analysts will need applications because it serves a couple of purposes for us, right? It serves the purpose of data collection, but it also serves the purpose of providing insights back, right, in a digestible form to people. So that can be through dashboards or some other thing. The question is really, sort of the extent to which an organization is willing to take those on as model-driven applications, right, from the knowledge graph, or whether they're more comfortable, sticking with traditional relational systems, large information systems. For example, I know that IDA is certainly not yet comfortable considering moving from our existing financial system, for example. For those reasons that you specified, our analysts are very comfortable with that system. It has all the business logic built in to help us not make mistakes. It collects data in a way that is easy for our financial team to use, right? So from my perspective, there's not a real problem there. But in other areas, there is a problem, right? Where we have systems that are far too complicated. They confuse our staff. They're not integrated properly, and we could build something simpler from the knowledge graph itself.
Heather, quick question in regards to just your overall core team. It sounds like you interact with a lot of the business domain owners, but what's the core team look like?
What a great question, Steve. So our core team is pretty fluid. Right now we have myself and a deputy, and then we have a data governance committee, which has a representative from across each organization, which sort of serves quadruple duty as both governing data and also participating as the touch points in all of our interactions in order to fill out these models. But given that we're a research organization, we don't have a very hierarchical structure here at IDA. So when we need someone, we just go and get them, and they become part of the team for the day. And when their job is done, we put them back and we pull in the next person. So it isn't the case, for example, that everyone reports through, a single, business line, for example. People are fluid across mission areas, across, ops and research for us. So our, we're sort of unique, I think, in that way compared to many other folks.
And actually, Heather, I think that approach and methodology, if you will, helps the success in moving towards, that common goal that you're trying to achieve. And I know, just because our team is helping you there, is that things have moved very quickly from the modeling standpoint. So if you would like to, Heather, join the networking group, because we're running out of time here for this segment, but would love to hear more perspective there if you did have time, and you can set up a table and we can just take further questions that way.
Sounds great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Heather.
Thank you.